Today, we're looking at a question people often ask about Timothy. What exactly was the bias against him? The verse that usually starts the conversation is 1 Timothy 4:12. Here, Paul writes, "Don't let anyone despise your youth, but set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity." Most of us have heard the standard explanation before. Timothy was young, and people looked down on him because of his age. That's not wrong. But once you sit with the letter a little longer, the picture gets more specific. First, the word Paul uses for youth is neotes. For starters, this word does not mean a teenager. In the ancient world, the term covered a much wider stretch of life. The Septuagint regularly translates the Hebrew word naur in this same way, as seen in Genesis 8:21, which says, "The inclination of the human heart is evil from youth onward." The rich young ruler in the Gospels claims he has kept the commandments from his youth in Mark 10:20 and in parallels. Even Irenaeus later remarked in Against Heresies that 30 is the first stage of a young man's age and extends to 40, as all will admit. Roman military practice points in the same direction. Men enlisted between 17 and 25. They served 25 years and could still be regarded as young well into their 30s. Timothy's own timeline fits that picture. Acts 16:1 records that he joins Paul in Lystra during the apostles' second missionary journey, putting this event at around AD 50. In order to be effective with Paul, he would have to have been at least competent and responsible enough to be capable of handling himself without burdening Paul's efforts. This can put Timothy anywhere between the ages of 12 and 18, reasonably toward the older end of the scale, assuming he was only a young man at this stage of his life. Keep that in mind. Now, if we fast forward a bit, we get to 1 Timothy itself, which is usually dated after Paul's release from his first Roman imprisonment, which was somewhere in the early to mid-60s. If we assume that the numbers are around the most reasonable for both events in Timothy's life, we can safely conclude that he's roughly 30 years old, perhaps even older, when Paul writes this letter. That is about the same age Jesus was when he began his public ministry, according to Luke 3:23. We never picture Jesus as a novice, yet Paul still has to tell Timothy not to let anyone despise him for his youth. The cultural pressure against a younger leader was very real. Paul had already left Timothy in Ephesus with real responsibility, oversight of a church that was dealing with false teachers. So the problem is not that Timothy was completely inexperienced. The problem is that some people were treating his relative youth as a reason to dismiss him. Notice how Paul phrases it. He doesn't say, "Let no one despise you because you're young." He says, "Don't let anyone despise your youth." The youth itself is what's being treated as a liability. Age was being used as a convenient excuse to reject Timothy's authority and teaching. But why would that happen in Ephesus? The letter gives us some clues. In chapter 1, in verses 3 through 7, we learn that Ephesus had people who wanted to teach and assert influence, people Paul describes as promoting myths, endless genealogies, and controversies. Some of them appear to have been more established voices in the community. In that kind of setting, a younger man appointed by Paul could easily be waved off with the simple charge of, "He's too young, why should we listen to him?" There's also a cultural layer. In both Jewish and Greco-Roman society, age generally carried weight. Older men were expected to lead. Younger men were expected to wait their turn. Timothy's position inverted that expectation. He was leading while still relatively young, and that alone could generate resistance. But Paul doesn't stop at naming the problem. The second half of the verse is just as important. But set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. Paul's answer isn't for Timothy to demand respect or to argue about his credentials. The answer is consistent, visible character. If people are going to look down on Timothy's youth, then the way he speaks, the way he lives, the way he loves, the way he trusts God, and the way he keeps himself pure become the rebuttal. That list is deliberate. Speech and conduct cover the public and private life. Love and faith go to the heart of Christian maturity. Purity addresses the kind of integrity that mattered in a city like Ephesus, known for its temple culture and moral compromise. We see the same concern elsewhere too. In 1 Corinthians 16 and verses 10 and 11, Paul tells the Corinthian church about Timothy, saying, "If Timothy comes, see he has nothing to fear while with you, because he is doing the Lord's work, just as I am. So let no one look down on him." That's the same verb being used as it was in 1 Timothy 4, kataphroneo, to despise or look down on. Paul is consistently concerned that Timothy's youth will become a reason for people to dismiss him, and so he instructs Christians to reject this kind of thinking. There's one more detail worth noticing here. Timothy was half Gentile. His father was Greek, and his mother was Jewish. In some circles, that mixed background could itself have been a point of suspicion. But Paul never makes that the center of the issue in 1 Timothy. The explicit issue he names is youth. That suggests that the primary bias Timothy faced in Ephesus was generational, not ethnic. So the bias against Timothy was the tendency to dismiss him because of his age, using youth as a reason to reject his teaching and leadership. Paul doesn't deny the cultural reality, he simply refuses to let it have the final word. Instead, he calls Timothy to a higher standard. Live in such a way that the quality of your example makes the criticism look small. That remains a useful word for any of us who feel underestimated, whether because of age, background, or lack of formal status. The biblical answer is not to demand recognition. It is to become the kind of person whose speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity quietly silence the critics. Thanks for listening, my friends. I hope this has been helpful for your Bible study. Grace and peace to you as you continue your walk with God.